topic with Dr. Charles Pinderhughes, professor of psychiatry at Boston University and one of the nation's outstanding experts in this area.
By and large, I see two different systems present in all isms. In every single one of them, there's what I like to refer to as an initiator and an accommodator. And the party, which is the initiating party, presents and cajoles or seduces or employs power or rewards, some other inducement to get the accommodator to accept the belief system, basic attitudes, and the social structure which the initiating party sets forth. And this seems to be true whether the parties, men and women, whites and blacks, teachers and students, management and labor, developed countries and underdeveloped countries, whatever paired parties interacting in this kind of way, whether an initiating party and accommodating party. So that the first thoughts that I have, that each functions as a part of the environment of the other, exerting some kind of effect on each other.
Your description is interesting, particularly since we're trying to focus on some of the mental health aspects of racism and the other isms, although we know perfectly well that we're going to have to get into the social aspects because it's so hard to separate them. But your description was particularly interesting because it came very close to the description of the dyad or the dyadic interaction called psychotherapy. One wonder whether there wasn't a similar model there, and what implications what you said has to our understanding of psychotherapy now.
In one paper that I have on racism and psychotherapy, I express my belief that the relationship of the therapist to patient usually is basically racist in nature. However, one of the things that hopefully takes place in psychotherapy is the use of enough introjective mechanisms by both the patient and the psychotherapist for each of them to be able to take in and build up a fairly accurate and balanced image of the other. And as they do this, then the image that they have of one another and the persons that they relate to are based upon the building up of more realistic introjects, so to speak, and much less on projection. Those persons who use a psychotherapy method which emphasizes the fact that the therapist basically is projecting all the time just as much as the patient is projecting onto the therapist, and each of them needs to have this kind of corrective experience. Unfortunately, some therapists using authoritative methods can employ basically racist, classist, or some other kind of ism approach in which they seek to get the patient's system, so to speak, to become subjugated to the dominance role of the therapist.
What you've introduced is important for us to clarify as quickly as we can, because I would think that most of our listeners who are involved in some sort of psychotherapy, whether it employs drugs or employs verbal means, are concerned with freeing the potential of men and women who come to them, who function as effectively as possible based on whatever goals and values the person called the patient has. And yet, what you've suggested, of course, which I think we have to accept, is that the therapists themselves have racist and classist and sexist attitudes. And what steps can we take to ensure that the psychotherapist frees himself from these attitudes in relationship to the patients? Or is there any way we can assure ourselves of this, or any approach we can take? Or do we need a new group of therapists trained in a different philosophy and discipline? In other words, are we too far gone?
The principle that I would think needs to be kept in mind is one of having functioning feedback with which the therapist can constantly correct the impressions that he's gaining, more closely conforming to the nature of the patient's experience, the real nature of the patient's experience. The truth of the matter is the therapist can never fully have his impressions conform to the patient's experience, because the therapist is always, by his very nature, having additional associations from within his own body and his own central nervous system activated and attached to the impressions that are coming from the patient. So there's always an additional part in the therapist that's false. But now I would say too that the use of forums, presentation of material in psychiatric forums is one way to do it. The standardization of medical rationales and medical methods, all of these are part of what we call the professional development, the professionalism that goes into our work is important as a way of correcting and managing the defects that exist within us and which we will introduce into our practices if we don't have methods for managing it.
Some people have suggested that if we want to bring mental health care, let's say, to black people, and we want to make the situation as meaningful as possible with as minimal stress to the therapist and patient, maybe we ought to have black therapists for black people and white therapists for white people and work for social change in the future, and then maybe we can get the mix. But it hasn't worked very well up till now, the mix, that white therapists have not been able to shake off their backgrounds. I wonder if you're more optimistic about whether we can continue to have a mix.
I'm fairly optimistic. I've never seen anyone who was able to live with only the white part of themselves or with only the black part of themselves, which leaves me in the position of assuming that all of what we call white people have both white and black parts, and all of what we call black people have both white and black parts.
Now, what about the problem that we might potentially be confronted with in the black population, where perhaps large groups of people who, of course, object severely to the subservient position they've been placed in, but on the other hand, there may be some psychic benefit to having been as the group that is not as bound by the same morality and conscience as the white group. This gives them a sense of freedom, and the conscience can now be whitey, and one has more license. Although at a conscious level, I would anticipate most black people would reject that. From a psychodynamic point of view, do you think that this is a problem in terms of racism as a stress and what one would want to deal with psychotherapeutically?
That's one way of looking at it. And if we have that exclusive view, we might fail to recognize a kind of group formation that's needed in order to control those things and the supports that each individual needs in the way of a family, in the way of cultural supports. For instance, the lack of organization at low levels in society as compared with upper levels. As fast as leaders are produced, it's fascinating how rapidly they then become co-opted into the white society rather than useful in the further organization of black. And having successfully destroyed the black cultural pattern, as opposed to, for instance, Jewish group, when they were in slavery, they had the family and cultural patterns maintained. Their ghettos became something of a sanctuary, so to speak, as compared with the more disorganized ghetto situations of blacks whose group structure was very greatly interfered with.
As an internationally known clinical psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who has investments in sort of current treatment modalities as well as investments in the future, do you think that our currently popular approaches to the treatment of what we call psychopathology or mental problems is going to help individuals develop the kind of orientation necessary to live in a society where one deals with shared values and community responsibilities? It seems to me that most of our treatment modalities are aimed at a number of things. One is to help the person adapt to society as it is. Two, to help the person be more successful with his achievement orientation in a competitive society, and to express himself more individually and his individual potential more. Will we have to develop new approaches to what we consider psychopathology in order to move towards this community-oriented or communal living, almost?
I think that the only way to do that, unfortunately, is through confrontation processes. Actually, the non-negotiable position of the therapist of yesterday was based on his belief that that was the way it had to be done. And it was only when the therapist encountered non-negotiable positions taken by patients and assumed by our new professionals that they began to take a look at other possibilities. And these confrontation processes which occur, basically, the only kinds of processes that work where there is an irrational belief system, and every group has its irrational belief systems. And I perceive the opportunity for confrontation to occur in the present-day society at a level at which it never was. And this is why that high level of anxiety, high level of conflict, and the high rate of change. I think that the kind of crisis state that shifts in location, the civil rights movement moved from black people to other lower classes, to poor, to women, and one finds it shifting from urban settings in 1 year to colleges in another year and to prisons in another, always in relation to some previously oppressed group, but same processes, and always the same methods, and always the same interactions taking place, with confrontation processes being the principal tool for producing change. Eldridge Cleaver put it in graphic terms and related it also to this discussion we've had about the renunciation of one part of oneself and projection of it on another party, an outside party. As he put it, in the slave relationship, the white man lost his body and the black man lost his mind, gave up his mind. And in the integration process, and in the processes going on today, the white man is recovering his body and the black man is recovering his mind. And this has to do with initiative as well as with other things.
In this discussion, the focus will be on how life stresses acting through the brain, nervous system, and endocrine systems may affect physiologic functions and possibly be the direct precipitants of a variety of physiologic disorders. The importance of ameliorating the influence of life stress in the treatment of a variety of somatic diseases is also of importance. The need to assist patients in developing better adaptive and coping mechanisms for life stress in the treatment of and the overall management of medical problems needs to be reviewed. I discussed this whole topic with Peter Knapp, who is professor of psychiatry at Boston University, associate chairman of the division, as well as an outstanding expert in psychosomatic diseases. I asked Dr. Knapp how he perceived the relationship of life stress to physical disease.
You begin to see that specific kinds of reaction to specific kinds of conflict can influence disease at various ways. It can contribute to chronic overactivity of autonomic and systems, finally going on to causing structural damage. It can predispose possibly to the presence or development of disease in an individual under specific kinds of life conflict. It may contribute in other ways that we don't know about to a wide variety of diseases. The stress concept has to become spelled out in much more detail, and I think the psychosomatic contribution to disease has to be spelled out in more detail in a whole variety of ways, in a whole variety of disorders.
There's another kind of feedback that we have to perhaps think about, which is feedback from one's culture. And that may be of some importance, particularly in looking at psychosomatic type illnesses or illnesses that somehow are related to activity in the brain, in that, it's been reported that certain kinds of illnesses are absent in one culture and present in another. In your experience, how important is this cultural factor, the kind of subculture a person comes from, and the kinds of physiologic disorders that can develop?
I think it's a fascinating question. It's wide open. There's the old story that the African Negro didn't get hypertension in Africa, and then when he comes to the United States, does develop it. Again, that's almost part of the early mythology of psychosomatic medicine, because no really good studies have worked that out. It's a whole transcultural investigation in psychosomatic medicine that is crying out to be done. You have to disentangle the possible genetic contribution from our own experience for many years now with asthma. I'm utterly convinced that asthma occurs in a genetically loaded individual. A baby doesn't come into the world and develop infantile eczema within a week or 2 weeks of birth without having some kind of genetic loading, and the family histories that one gets from people in the cardiovascular area, in the allergic area, and in the schizophrenic area, for that matter, if one studies it very, very carefully. Look as though there is some kind of general predisposition that is passed on in some way. I don't think we have the foggiest idea what the nature of that is.
Is there any relationship, perhaps an inverse relationship, between the development of psychopathology, as it's expressed in behavior and affective disturbance, or in cognitive problems, and the development of certain psychophysiologic syndromes under conditions, for example, like overcrowding or a condition of loss?
I think one of the early formulations, again, almost belonging to the mythology of psychosomatic medicine, or mythology of psychopathology in a broader sense, is that nice entities exist and they substitute back and forth for each other. If a person has a psychosomatic disease, it's a masked psychosis, and he may break out of this psychosomatic disease and become psychotic, or if he has psychosis, he won't develop this psychosomatic disease. And then a third great avenue of expression, namely action, also gets drawn into the theory. It's a marvelous dream, you know, that in the future we will be able to get a predictive handle on a whole host of diseases, and finally it comes down to the dream, and some people would call it a nightmare, of genetic manipulation. But I think man is complex. He has difficulty in studying an organism as complex as himself, and it's going to be some time before we really have the right kind of predictive handle, and there are a number of difficulties in the way, because you've got not only to have the prediction inside your head, you've got to instill the predictive conviction inside the head of the subject.
The fact that stress emanates from the current requirements of the environment which are imposed on man does not necessarily mean that man is trapped. It is conceivable that the environment can be changed to meet the needs of man and the capabilities of man. In the next discussion, we focus on the possibility of developing means to more adequately program the environment, which may in the future help individuals living in that environment. This topic is discussed with Dr. George Ruff, who is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Ruff is an outstanding educator who has had considerable experience in the development of our current aerospace program. I spoke to him by telephone about the stresses with which we may be confronted as a result of our current technological developments and the goals towards which man seems to be moving.
People are still going to have the same things inside of them and outside of them that have always bothered them in the past. In fact, I suppose in the long run, the things that will be stressful for people 100 years from now will be pretty much like the ones that have been stressful before. But there will be new ones, and that's what we're focusing on now. And I think that the more fluid relationships people have with each other, and then the technological changes, including the very strong possibility that the standard of living is going to drop, maybe precipitously eventually, is going to add to this.
When we think about the change in the level of affluence or the standard of living, is this a function, do you think, of population change or the modification of the resources that we'll have available? Or is there some other factor that you're thinking about?
Well, I think it's both. Again, I think the other factors are a disenchantment, if I can use that phrase, with the results that our technological society have brought us. And it's not so much that a change in the standard of living per se would be destructive, but the optimism that people have had may well change. You know, we've always had this rather odd view of the world as going to improve in every way. Going to be more peace, less poverty, everything is going to be better. And now I think people are going to have to cope with the idea that not everything will be better. And I think if the kids get this idea from the beginning, it probably isn't going to be so much of a problem. The problem, as you stated before, is more for us.
That raises the question then of what your concept of the source of stress that people are experiencing now. Where's the major source of this stress, or the major sources? Is this coming from the unfulfilled expectations, or is it coming from sort of internal values and goals and incongruities with what people can find in the outer world, or is it coming from the technological advance, or do you think we shouldn't talk about stresses as being different now than before, that it's really the same contemporary stresses, stress of the past?
What are going to be stressful in the future, I think, are largely the internal problems that arise out of our human dilemmas in growing up. We start out as weak children, you know, in a world of adults and develop future. And this is what's going to bother people most. You mentioned the space program. We didn't find in the space program that the things that bothered the astronauts had so much to do with being up in space vehicles and dangers as the ordinary human concerns about who was picked for a flight, what was the implications for people who weren't picked for the flight, and those things will continue. But I think in addition to that, there's going to be more uncertainty. And uncertainty itself is a highly stressful thing for the future. It seems to accelerate year by year.
When you look at a society, as we're now suddenly having some information on, like the Chinese society, and a lot of the information we appreciate is incomplete, where there may have been some changes, at least in contrast to our society. Do you get the feeling that the stress-induced illnesses are less in a society like in China, current People's Republic?
Well, my guess would be that they are, but again, the grass may be greener in that particular sense. I think what we heard about China has, been fairly carefully filtered. But if I can take just the evidence of what we've been hearing recently, it does sound that way. It sounds like the educational system has aimed people in the direction of the society as it is existing, as it is evolving, and they've been fairly comfortable in that. They seem to have eliminated a lot of social problems. Now, along the way, I think they've cut down on the number of options available to people, and I'm sure for people who like a lot of options, like you and I do, that's probably a disadvantage. But for many people, it may not be a disadvantage.
Suppose one of our colleagues is confronted with helping to develop a preventative program for a group about to be engaged in space travel of a year and a half's duration. Does he have the models at his disposal to help develop a program?
Not really. Nobody has considered that seriously, at least seriously enough to do more than token research on it. I don't think now we could really figure out how to have a group interact for a mission to Mars. We probably could get by with it because people are adaptable. But I think after we've had Skylab projects and things of that kind and begun to have some more experience, coupled with laboratory research, we'll be in a better position to do it.
As you've been talking in response to my question, I realized that I may have been using the same defense that perhaps many people in the world are using, and that is to deal with a theoretical problem which isn't really very pressing to avoid one that is pressing. For example, rather than having asked you about a trip to Mars or Jupiter, maybe what I should have asked you is, what kind of things do we need to prepare for if man must go in glass-enclosed cities because he's polluted the air so much that he can no longer exist? That's much more of a real possibility that we're confronted with. And does man have, currently, do we have the adaptive capacity to move into the glass-enclosed cities? Or as John Kennedy suggested, maybe we ought to build cities under the ocean. That was 10 years ago.
I believe we have that capacity, especially because they don't come about tomorrow. First people begin to talk about them and somebody says that's way out. Then people they view as responsible spokesmen begin to talk about them and they think, well, maybe there's something to it, And so step by step you move in that direction. I think people are prepared for major changes like that. And it's not to say that everyone's going to be comfortable with it, but I think it can be done.
Well, I'm glad to hear you're optimistic and encouraging.
My big problem is not can people adapt to it, but is it going to work?
At no time, since the 17th century perhaps, has there been so much doubt as to whether society will continue to evolve constructively or whether it will break under the pressures of its own complexity. We've been assured to some extent by the experts on this tape that stress is a concept which has always been with us, that its definitions will expand as technology and population expand, and that in fact we may be in danger of overutilizing it, making it a catch-all. Perhaps, as mental health specialists, we can help to direct a definition for the benefit of treating patients who suffer from environmental as well as physically or emotionally induced illness, or what has been aptly called existential stress. We must also rely on the social system to guide us through. Most of all, we ourselves must undergo the experience of adaptation and become broader, more faceted, and more tolerant of change. Only then can we invest in an exciting future.
Produced by the Council for Interdisciplinary Communication in Medicine Limited, under a grant from Smith, Kline and French Laboratories.
ChicagoMayorVote.com. come here. Hey, Mexican.
Hey girls, hey Regal, hey Rabbi.
Oh God, here's this troll. Hold on one second.
I'm not a troll, you're a troll. You're the troll, you're projecting on me. You're projecting on me. Stop projecting on me. Stop projecting on me.
Okay, there you go.
Hello? Do you believe in humans?
Yeah, mine was she's pretty much a full indoor outdoor, and but she's funny, like she'll like cower and she kind of hides and then she waits for my kids to walk by.